Hello, everyone. My name is Kelly Munn, and I am with the League of Education Voters. In fact, I've newly been promoted to Chief Advocacy Officer, which is pretty exciting. Welcome to our free online webinar series, Lunchtime Levинars. We started this series 4 years ago to share information and build knowledge on important and timely issues. Today's webinar is about an incredibly important issue and one that affects children all across our state. And it's about the special education landscape in Washington state. When we focus on improving special education, we have the ability to lift the tide for all students. In this free webinar today, Washington Special Education Assistant Superintendent Glenna Gallo will outline the current state of special education funding, describe her vision for special education moving forward, and we'll have time to answer a few of your questions. But first, let me give you a little bit of background. Glenna Gallo is the Assistant Superintendent of Special Ed in the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction in Washington State, often referred to as OSPI. Prior to that, she spent 7 years as the State Director of Special Education for the Utah State Board of Education. She has 21 years of public education experience teaching students with disabilities and adults, and over 13 years of experience in state-level educational leadership, with expertise in the planning, management, and monitoring of public special education programs. While at the Utah State Board of Education, she successfully implemented large-scale changes in the use of data, collaboration, and delivery of evidence-based professional development, all of which resulted in positive changes in the outcomes of students with disabilities. Glenna has a BS and an MS in special education, an administrative license, and an MBA. Glenna feels strongly that application of the intent of IDEA requirements results in increased students' outcomes for students with disabilities, and works with administrators, special education staff, advocates, and parents of students with disabilities at the LEA, state, and national levels to review research, current student achievement, and compliance data to ensure efforts are addressing instructional issues that impact results for students with disabilities. Collaboration is a priority for her work, and collaborative efforts are infused within all state efforts regarding students with disabilities. So before we begin, a couple of housekeeping items. You'll notice a question and answer function at the bottom of your screen. This is a space for you to pose by typing in questions to us. Please feel free to do this throughout this process. I may or may not answer the question during Glenna's presentation, but I will definitely leave time for at least 15 minutes of questions at the end of the presentation. As always, feel free to send any feedback about the webinar quality to us on that Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, or you could send it to info@educationvoters.org, which in that case, you're probably telling us the whole thing's failed. So with that, I'd like to welcome Glenna Gallo to speak about the special education landscape.
Thank you so much, Kelly. I'm very excited to be here today because this is one of my favorite topics of conversation, namely, how is it that we're going to improve outcomes for students with disabilities in Washington? Before I begin, I just want to acknowledge the limited time that we have available today. And so I'm going to hit some topics pretty quickly. The presentation will be available, and there are embedded links to more information if that's something of interest to you. With that, I'm going to start on the next slide and really look at the purpose and vision and mission of OSPI. And so looking at that, you can see that the vision of Superintendent Reichdahl is for all students prepared for post-secondary pathways, careers, and civic engagement. As we move forward, you're going to see that there are some large system changes that are coming to the K-12 educational system, namely around reducing opportunity gaps. Part of that you're going to see reflected not only in those OSPI values listed below on the slide, but also in the OSPI special education priorities that we'll review today. With that, I'm going to move to the next slide And just, I would like you to highlight the equity statement that is here. The work that we're doing, while not perfect, is aimed at ensuring educational equity. And so it requires everyone involved in the educational system, from leaders, community members, parents, and educators, to really examine the way that our current policies and practices result in disparate outcomes for specific groups of students. Because of that, we're going to spend some time really examining our practices, historical and current, and then identifying ways that we can make improvements in a large scale way. On the next slide, you're going to see OSPI Special Education Services. So in Washington, we have approximately 145,000 students with disabilities. When I'm using the term students with disabilities in the context of this presentation, I am talking about students who are eligible under IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, which means that they not only meet one of the 13 disability categories, but it impacts their educational performance and it requires specialized instruction. So this is not inclusive of students who are only on a 504 plan. So you can see we have some responsibilities. OSPI is responsible to provide technical assistance and professional development. We're also required to engage stakeholders in decisions, as well as look at general supervision, which is looking at examining and making corrections to the entire system using monitoring, dispute resolution, and coordinated data efforts. And then finally, the topic that seems to be most commonly discussed, we have a responsibility to allocate special education funding, whether either federal IDEA funding or state special education funding. So that was just a brief review. Today's objectives. I really want to talk to you about some shared purposes that we have, not only around IDEA, but around the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. I also want to highlight some reflections from data around Washington students with disabilities. Where are the areas where we can build on our strengths? What are the opportunities we have for improvement? Where should we explore more? And how do we increase active engagement? And then following that, really look at what are the priorities, how are we applying input we've received, and what are the decision packages moved forth from OSPI that really impact students with disabilities. And then after that, we're going to do, as Kelly said, about 15 minutes of questions and answers. So that's a big lift for today. So I'm just going to jump right into it. I really wanted to talk to you about a shared purpose. And here is a student with disabilities who's in a Washington public school learning. The teacher's not showing in that picture. But I want to highlight something stated by Superintendent Reichdahl. And looking at this, you can see he said, "I have a relentless belief that education and the passion of young people will see us through to brighter days." Why? It always has. When we focus on the success of young people, we have a shared purpose, and we crystallize progress through greater equity in public education. This is something that really stands out to me in my role in special education, in that we have to focus on what's going well while we work to improve the items that aren't going well. So with that, I'm going to move on to the two laws that are creating kind of this system of change in Washington currently. And so when we're talking about students with disabilities, we know that IEP teams, for the most part, make decisions regarding educational services that are provided to the student. There are two ends to that decision-making process. The one that frequently comes up is IDEA, which really talks about a free, appropriate public education, or FAPE, that emphasizes the services designed to meet the student's unique needs, and then prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. IDEA's purpose is very specific, and it's about that area in bold, preparing them for life after school, which requires a unique set of individualized instruction. a lot of times when we're working with students with disabilities, we forget about that end purpose and we get caught up in the moment. And so I want to take you over to the other side of the slide and the Every Student Succeeds Act, of which their purpose is to ensure a significant opportunity to receive a fair, equitable, and high-quality education and close achievement gaps. So for the first time in history, we have IDEA, which has been around for many years at this point, and we have ESSA, which now supports the premise behind IDEA. And so it's really allowing kind of unprecedented opportunity to really focus on the needs of students with disabilities. With that, I've already hit kind of the fact that we have about 145,000 students with disabilities in Washington. This slide shows you those 13 disability categories and the percentage in each category. What I think is really interesting about this is you can see that the highest percentage are students who have specific learning disabilities, followed by students who have other health impairment, which is listed as health impairment, and communication disorders. One of the things that I think is interesting when we look at these numbers is that a lot of times when we're talking publicly about the needs of students with disabilities, we forget about the scale and the continuum of disability and severity. And we tend to make decisions based on students with the most significant needs, forgetting that the majority of students have average abilities and have the ability to achieve everything that all students in Washington Public Ed do. And so I just want to highlight that as you're having those conversations, are you looking at the abilities and the strengths and how to leverage those, or are we focusing on deficits and creating a siloed system that doesn't support improvement? Moving on, like I said, one of the things that I love the most is being able to look at data and identify changes or strengths from it. Based on the short time we had available today, I just had to summarize some things. And so I wanted to show you there's definitely some strengths in the system here in Washington Public Ed. We see very dedicated staff. People are committed for students. They are interested in continuous improvement. When we identify non-compliance, for the most part, people are working together to resolve that. And we're seeing very timeliness in reports and responses. We do definitely have some areas of improvement. And you're going to hear more about these as we start digging into our priorities. But the graduation and dropout rates for students with disabilities. I think that sometimes IEP teams are quick to use alternate pathways to graduation. We do have lower graduation rates and higher dropout rates than our target is set for. We also have a robust dispute resolution system under IDEA, but I see that people tend to use it, the more formal processes, such as a citizen complaint or a due process complaint, rather than accessing early dispute resolution options, such as facilitated meetings or mediation. The other thing that I hear a lot about from parents is a need to focus on inclusionary practices. So how is it that we ensure students with disabilities access the general education classroom and their non-disabled peers while still receiving quality special education services? And along with that is, how do we make sure that students with disabilities have access to grade level learning standards and that IEP teams are writing goals that are in support of that access? And then lastly, how is it that we use assessments, whether they're classroom-based assessments or statewide assessments? And that's definitely an area where I see some frequent confusion and some application of practices that aren't in alignment with our goals. With that, areas of exploration. I'm really trying to work with school district personnel to examine their data. How are IEP teams making decisions? Are those decisions supporting their goals and their priorities, or are they contrary to those goals and priorities? We've already talked about kind of the alternate pathway to diploma. The third one is something that's come out through the safety net process and the use of non-public agencies, as well as some concerns and some exploration that we want to do around the data regarding discipline of students with disabilities and the use of restraint and isolation in emergency situations. Safety net processes, we're going to talk more about that, as well as how do we use funding effectively and contribute to professional learning and coaching that changes the way that instruction is provided to students. And then last but not least, you can see that I have some basic goals around how is it that we increase active engagement. So how is it that we really bring in our partners in parent and community organizations, as well as professional organizations, and identify where we have shared ownership and where we can commit to making improvements to the process together, rather than against each other. So again, that's a brief review, but I just want to show you on the next slide how that leans into the 6 priorities. So OSPI Special Education Division has, after multiple meetings with the public, identified 6 main priorities for how we want to improve outcomes for students with disabilities. This slide shows a summary of those 6 areas. You can see we have leadership, where we're looking at shared leadership and ownership of students with disabilities outside of the traditional special education system. That's needed to improve results and reduce areas of disproportionality. We also need to consider the growth mindset. Do we have increased expectations of students with disabilities? Does that apply to the standards that we access, the instruction we provide, the graduation pathways they use, the assessments that are administered? Are we showing that they need, that they have meaningful attendance? Are IEP team decisions being made to support that? And do we see resulting outcomes showing the improvement? The third is evidence-based practices. And there we're really looking at how is it that we use a multi-tiered system of support framework, as well as inclusionary practices and evidence-based practices to increase access and progress in the grade level learning standards. So if you remember, going back to the intent and purpose in IDA and ESSA, it was to prepare students to have a meaningful life outside of school by making progress in the grade level standards and decreasing the opportunity gap. So that third priority is around that. Fourth is professional development. How is it that we train all of the people who have an impact on students with disabilities? And then looking at resources, which we're going to dedicate quite a bit of time today. And then the last is how do we ensure that we have the right people and adequate numbers of people for recruitment and retention of services. One of the things that I want to point out about these priorities is that we need to focus on all 6. We are not able to make meaningful and lasting change if we only focus on a subset of those. So moving forward, that's what we're looking at. Looking next, so one of the things that we were talking about is safety net funds. And the safety net funds shows up across those priorities. I'm not sure how familiar you are with safety net funding, but it's funding that's in place for school districts to apply for in the event that they have extraordinary special education costs that are not covered by the basic education and special education funding allocations. There has been a legislative work group working on improvements to the safety net process over the last year. And that work group has made recommendations to Superintendent Reichdahl, and recommendations will be moving forward to changing the WACs and also some legislative suggestions coming into the next session. The main points of the input from that work group is that they requested that we remove IDA funds from safety net and allocate those to districts directly. They also asked us to consider the fiscal impact of the increased use of non-public agencies. And so a data point that we've seen is that there's been an increase in using non-public agencies to address significant behavioral needs of students with disabilities. And that's something we really want to examine, knowing that there needs to be a full continuum of placement options available, and also making sure that districts have capacity to provide supports in the least restrictive environment. The third option is they really asked us to look at the requirement for a properly formulated IEP. IEP compliance and compliance with IDA is valuable and is necessary. And it's not the only thing that we need to look at. We also need to consider impact of services to students and whether those services impacted their outcomes. And so that's kind of the purpose behind bullet number 3. The fourth one is looking at how do we transition to an electronic process and make the process easier for districts to apply for and receive that reimbursement. And then finally, how we could look at a tiered multiplier in place of the current 0.9609 multiplier that we have. I'm going to talk more about those in a minute. Moving on to the next slide, another partner that's supporting the work that's being done by OSPI Special Education is the State Special Ed Advisory Council, or SEAC. You can see on the left, the SEAC has recommendations for OSPI that they're focusing on this coming year. They're looking not only at increasing special ed funding and looking at ESSA implementation, but how is it that we build an inclusive school culture and engage families and communities? And then along with that, reduce the use of restraint and isolation in schools and provide effective training to pre-service and in-service educators. There's a couple links in there if you want to see the annual report from last year or the SEAC brochure. And I just want to call attention to the meetings that are scheduled, including on November 6th, a meet and greet opportunity on from 6 to 7:30 p.m. If you click that link on upcoming meetings, it will take you to the page that has all of those details. So moving on, decision packages. So OSPI, in preparation for the legislative session, has provided a plan for how we're going to accomplish the mission and visions of OSPI. And that plan also addresses the special education priorities. Here on this slide, I've listed the 5 decision packages that have the greatest level of impact on students with disabilities. Again, all of these are linked and the full information is available on our website for each one. With that, I'm going to just dive into each one quickly and then open it up for questions. So the first one is the safety net maintenance level report. What you can see here is a projection over the next 4 fiscal years, and running down the left side, you can see the number of high-need student applications that we anticipate receiving based on historical data, the costs that we tend to see per application. The community impact is something that I'm not going to go into detail about. But looking down, that annual demand, the 4th row, is the total amount of the requests that OSPI receives from school districts around providing these high-cost special education services. Currently, the State General Fund provides $35,952, and you can see in the first year, we project a request for $73,129,880. Every year, over $14 million of federal IDA funds are reserved for this purpose of reimbursement, which brings us to a current funding amount annually of available funding of $50,739,000. Yet you can see there's an unfunded gap that we're projecting. So the first year is a little over 22 million, the next year 33 million, and finally the 4th year $60 million. We're calculating those data based on the information that's been provided, a review of those applications, and are verifying that those costs are indeed true and accurate. So this is a part of the request that OSPI will be making legislatively. Along with that, you're going to see on the next slide the safety net supplemental request. So in the current year, we had a shortfall of $4,415,000 in safety net funding based on what was requested and awarded. So OSPI is asking the legislature for those additional funds to finalize those reimbursements. Moving on, I'm going to talk about the special education multiplier model. So this is an excess cost multiplier. It was historically set back in 1995 at 0.9309. It changed in the last session to 0.9609. And the premise behind this model is that it delivers the same amount of funding for each student with disabilities in FTE attendance, regardless of the intensity and types of services that are being provided. The current funding doesn't reflect the cost to deliver services in different settings, nor does it incentivize districts to promote inclusion in the general ed classroom. While this was being considered by the Safety Net Legislative Work Group, they recommended that OSPI put forth a multi-tiered model. And if you look at the next slide, you can see that the proposed model really looks at three key concepts. It considers the direct hours of special education services to be provided to the student. It considers the instructional setting, and it considers the intensity of services to be delivered. So with that, it also looks at how is it that we can increase those funding over the next 3 biennia while reducing school district reliance on levies to fulfill those current funding gaps. So looking at that, you can see over the next 4 years, the anticipated increase in special education funding, which should be used to reduce the reliance on levies. And then if you look at the next slide, you're going to see the graphic that just kind of shows you some of the values that we're considering around this multiplier. So the first one is the total weekly hours of service. Looking at the setting, you can see it's divided into groups. So the first group of 4 rows looks at services in the general ed setting 80 to 100% of the time. The next 2 rows is 40 to 79% of the time, then less than 39%, and then looking at other placements. If you're familiar with the LRE continuum, that's where that's coming from. And then the third column looks at intensity of services. And then looking across, you can see over the next 4 years, what happens with those multipliers and the shifting of those multipliers, either to increase or decrease. And so what we're anticipating with that is for it to incentivize providing quality, effective special education services within the special ed classroom. I want to wrap this up, and so I'm just going to skip through the next few, but we're looking at professional learning days, and OSPI and the superintendent are requesting 3 additional days of professional learning, and it would be around specific topics of equity, diversity, and race, inclusionary practices, and then strengthening social emotional learning. And you can see those amounts listed there. And then finally, comprehensive supports for all. And here we're looking at increasing essential staffing. And so looking at that last bullet, school counselors, nurses, and family and community engagement coordinators. So with that, I just want to remind you, again, that was a really quick overview of a lot of information, but I'm going to open it up to questions now.
Thank you so much, Glenna. We have 10 minutes for questions. I've got a few coming in, but I just want to remind you, you can ask questions at the bottom of the screen using the question and answer tab. Here is one really large scale question, and this leads me to encourage people to ask questions that are, we have a lot of people listening to this, and special education can be very personal. I have 2 kids who were provided an IEP and a 504, and I always went right to what my kids need, and I'm gonna encourage you to go higher up so that you can talk in reference to all kids or a whole lot of kids who would be trying to get the same services. This discussion is about the system, not the individual. So one first big, huge system question is, you came from Idaho. What is some of the things, Utah, thank you, from Utah. And what were some of the things that when you came to Washington State that you thought we were doing well, and where did you see perhaps a few opportunities compared to where you were before?
Okay. You know what? One of the things that I was incredibly excited about when I came to Washington was the collaboration and the enthusiasm in the field of education and special education to look at what improvements are needed and to make a change. Without a doubt, pretty much anywhere I walked in and talked to people, people would say, like, we're so excited. What is it that we're going to do? Like, give us a plan, talk to us about what's going to change, what's going to happen. That is not the way that people traditionally address change or respond to change. Usually people are a little more reticent, so I could tell that Washington had been kind of identifying areas that they needed to improve on. Those 6 priorities that I showed you weren't developed by me. Without a doubt, when I went out and showed people data and had conversations, they were able to identify those 6 areas. They may call them something slightly differently, but whether I talk to parents or administrators or community members or general ed teachers, that's what came up. So it's rare that I've walked in and found a community that has already identified the areas in which they need to improve. Areas that I was surprised about, I was surprised about Washington's previous interactions with a multi-tiered system of support. That was something that I expected to be further along and conversations to be occurring about. Washington has some very sophisticated data analyses and public data reporting, and I wasn't seeing that being systematically included when I talked to stakeholders. I wasn't seeing that be utilized or referred to. And then the last one is, one of the things that I talked about was the field jumping to more formal dispute resolution processes, such as citizens' complaints and due processes. And I was surprised that there weren't more people accessing those early dispute resolution options to resolve things quicker through either facilitation or mediation, knowing that the intent is to improve the services in the system for an individual student. And so that would be my, I think, a quick summary.
Thank you. I'm going to follow up on the MTSS, and there's several questions that have come in that are around how do we move away from isolating the, like say the learning disability of a child from say mental health issues or economic issues within the school. Essentially, how do we look at children as a whole child and work together?
So there's 2 things there. So one is the MTSS, a multi-tiered system of support, as a framework for addressing individual needs of students, regardless of whether they have a disability or not. And that's the larger system itself. What we really need to focus on is what are all of the different initiatives and opportunities that are available to support students, and how is it that we identify and involve and coordinate the services on behalf of a student and a student's needs. That's separate from how do we use kind of a response to intervention approach to determine eligibility. And sometimes I hear that people get confused by that and they want to mix those two systems up. One that's used for overall support and one that's used to determine eligibility. One of the things that we are moving forward with here in Washington over the next year is really pulling together some work groups to examine how we identify a specific learning disability, knowing that there's many different types of learning disabilities that impact about 8 different areas, and the need that we have to address the needs of students with dyslexia. And so we really need to identify the current approach, which allows us to use either a discrepancy calculation or a response to intervention approach or a combination of both, and open it up to what other evidence-based practices are in place or that as citizens of Washington we want to be in place, so that we can identify and build that support.
Thank you. So another theme in the questions, we have a lot of questions coming in, is transparency in the funding. So for an example that's given is safety net students. How can the community, the families, verify that the funding that's being received is going to their child, or that the funding they receive for safety net goes to the students who are receiving the services? I know that there's confidentiality issues here, but what about transparency in funding?
Right. Well, that one, that is not a question I was expecting. I'm actually trying to think through that. If there's a concern that funds aren't being used appropriately, or that the services on IEPs aren't provided, I would encourage parents and IEP members to have those conversations. As you remember, each student generates a set of funding, but then you have to look at capacity and how is it that you provide the services to students within a classroom, knowing that you have to combine, right, and braid some of that funding to provide effective educational support. So I would start with the IEP team and questions at the district level. If not, there's always a public information request. Those files could be considered educational records, and parents could request. We do sometimes receive requests to look at those applications on behalf of their children. But I think that a lot of that could be built in at the district and the school level with conversations. If parents demonstrated that they had an interest in those applications and what were included, I anticipate that districts would be willing to provide that information. And then OSPI is always available in the event that that's not what happens.
I'm going to ask one more question. I know you, Glenna, have to go. You're a busy woman. I'll end with one question, but I do want to encourage people to, one, send us messages about if we brought Glenna back, what big topics would you like to have covered? So please send that through the question and answer. And I will accumulate and type up the questions we're not getting to. And Glenna, I'm kind of putting you in a public spot, but if I could send them to you and you answer them and then I send it out to the people who listen today, would that be okay?
That would be fine. As a matter of fact, I'm scrolling through them and I was a little stressed because I didn't have time to respond to them, but I will and get that back to you. Yeah,
we'll do that. So, last one is about inclusion. It was in your, the leadership, the goals, kind of values around this work was inclusion. And somebody's asking the question, actually more than one person is asking the question around how would you incentivize inclusion into the schools and up to 80 to 100% inclusion?
Right. So that is, in looking at the feedback, I can see that there's some questions about why we're using that model. We're using that definition because it's a federal definition and we're already collecting data on that, so it was an easy one to use. But basically, the conversations that we're having is how is it that we can provide additional funding so that we can look at service delivery models in a general ed class that are not reliant only on the use of a paraeducator. So we really want people, the content experts and the experts around specialized instruction, to be able to work together and to provide the funding for them to be able to work together to include students in that instruction with their non-disabled peers. That's the goal behind that tiered multiplier. I can see there's varying reactions to it and some really great questions that I'm happy to get into in detail. And then again, these questions are going to help us tailor this request going forward.
Glenna, thank you so much. You explain really complex topics in ways that all of us can understand, and I really appreciate that. And you're really good at not doing the acronyms, what I'm not so great at. So it made it really an understandable presentation on a pretty hard to explain subject in a lot of ways, particularly the funding. So I just want to thank you again. And we do not have at LEV our next LEVinar scheduled, but we'll send it to you shortly. And thank you all for joining us today. If you have any additional questions or comments, go ahead and send them to me at kelly@educationvoters.org. And a recording of today's presentation will be available on our website within 24 hours. Please feel free to share it with your friends and colleagues. And again, thank you for attending, and we hope to see you in the future. Bye-bye.